Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you. Yes, it is. I am going to present to you on relational frame theory and prejudice. I would like to preface this by saying that I am by no means an expert on relational frame theory or prejudice. If you are interested in more information on this, I suggest reading Dixon, Refelt, Zlomke, Barnes-Holmes, Hayes, any of those sorts of articles, and they will be able to give you much more information than I. If you are not someone from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology watching this, absolutely review those people. Otherwise, if you are, this is an assignment for school, so please bear with me. All right, let's get started. So, prejudice is defined as a preconceived opinion not based on reason or actual experience. Though research suggests that prejudice has decreased over the last several decades, it still affects millions of Americans every single day. And it's easy to find research on what prejudice looks like in both overt behavior and covert brain activity. The real challenge is understanding how this prejudice is formed in the first place. This involves examining the conceptual development behind prejudice, examining it through basic research, translating those results, and then conducting applied research to support those experimental underpinnings. So in a very, very early study by Starts in 1958, they looked at generating preference towards or against specific nationalities through word association. Nationalities were paired with either positive, neutral, or negative words, and results showed that word pairings had an effect on how these participants rated their views of those nationalities through a Likert-style survey in the post-word association. But prejudice involves more than just these sorts of procedures. In a similar realm of association, relational frame theory, herein referred to as RFT, may offer a theoretical underpinning for how prejudice may be formed. So the purpose of this presentation is to discuss RFT, its role in prejudice, analyze basic and applied and traditional research in the field, and then offer a potential future direction for research. So let's get started with RFT. So per Hayes, Barnes-Holmes, and Roche, it is an approach to understand language, cognition, and concept development and treats responding as a generalized operant related to the subject's history of multiple exemplar training. I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but let's look into it a little bit further so that we can get a more full view of what RFT really is. So RFT is based off of Sidman's 1986 notion of stimulus equivalence, which is demonstrated through match-to-sample procedures. So in stimulus equivalence, there are three big concepts. The first is reflexivity, or that picture A equals the same picture A, identical matching. Then there's the notion of symmetry. So you teach that picture A equals picture B, so non-identical matching. And then once that's been reinforced, you test if the subject can do picture B to picture A without any direct teaching. And then there's transitivity. So we teach and reinforce that picture A equals picture B and that picture A equals picture C, and then test to see if the participant demonstrates that B equals C without any formal training. And this has been known as a sort of free learning in a sense. So as complex as it sounds, symmetry is demonstrated by 16-month-old children, and full equivalence learning through transitivity is demonstrated by approximately 24 months old. So now we talk about this in relation to RFT. So in RFT, symmetry is known as mutual entailment, and this transitivity is known as combinatory mutual entailment, as if it all wasn't confusing enough, right? But RFT differs and extends from stimulus equivalence in two different ways. So the first is transformation of functions. This is defined as when an established function of one stimulus transfers to another stimulus via combinatory mutual entailment. When this happens, we'll say a transformation of functions has occurred. It sounds very confusing, but it will make a lot more sense in an example. So Dower and colleagues in 1994, they used mutual entailment and combinatory mutual entailment to teach two different groups of arbitrary stimuli. So let's just say letters A, B, and C, again, keeping it consistent. So they taught these using match to sample, and then they paired one stimulus, C, with an electric shock. So it established, this direct pairing established stimulus C with a fear-eliciting function, right? They then measured skin conductance to test just how fear-eliciting this was. So then upon presenting stimulus A and stimulus B, despite not having a direct paired relation with the shock, they also increased skin conductance, demonstrating that a transformation of functions had occurred. So they had these initial arbitrary stimuli, one of them was paired with a shock, and then that shock ended up transferring to these other stimuli. So the transformation of function occurred because they went from arbitrary and having no function to now having a fear-eliciting function. Makes sense, right? Hopefully. And other studies have shown that this can also be the case for reinforcement. We can have a transformation of functions based off of mood and also sexual functions. So now the second reason that RFT extends from stimulus equivalence is that it uses both non-arbitrary relational responding and arbitrary relational responding. So non-arbitrary means that the stimuli are based on some kind of formal property like size or like weight. And then arbitrary relational responding means that they're based on some kind of non-physical property such as value or family relationship. So once these basic and non-arbitrary relational repertoires are established, they can be brought under increasingly more forms of subtle context control. And we'll explain this a little bit further, don't worry. So for example, a child may easily be taught to point to a toy car in an array when asked, which one's the car? The word is functions as the context clue that controls the child pointing to the car, as it signifies its equivalence, right? The spoken word car is then equivalent to the object itself. This is a form of non-arbitrary relational responding, right? The physical properties of the car denoting the choice. However, more complex relationships exist between objects than just pure equivalence. The context changes as the child is exposed to more complex responding tasks, such as when asked questions related to which one's bigger than, smaller than, faster, slower, more valuable, etc. The contextual phrases control the choice of a stimulus that is now not the car. Right? Are we kind of on the same page? With repeated exercises and exposure to new stimuli, people and children are able to respond to these context clues that are applicable to a wide variety of events and objects, some of which are entirely arbitrary and not identifiable from their formal features. So the classic example here is American currency. So American currency has coins that are all different sizes. And it would be really easy to place value based on the size, the physical property. But a dime is worth more than a nickel, despite it being smaller than the nickel. But this is easily taught to children. When reliable patterns of relational responding come under context control of environmental cues, those patterns are referred to as relational frames. And so some examples of frames that have been researched have been frames of sameness, opposition, difference, more than, less than, before, after, among many, many others. But how does this relational frame theory account for prejudice? So starts and starts created direct prejudice through word association, but prejudice extends beyond just crude word pairings. Events, faces, skin color, names, and even clothing have the ability to acquire aversive functions through this transformation of functions. Let's consider an example from Roche and colleagues in 2001. So he suggested that we may not need to learn prejudice directly from teachers, parents, or the media. And he used an example of the Irish. So let's say that on one occasion you hear that Irish people are heavy drinkers. You've probably heard this before. Stimulus A, the Irish. Stimulus B, heavy drinkers. And then on another occasion that's separate from the first, we hear that heavy drinkers tend to be dim-witted. Right? So we've got heavy drinkers B again, and then dim-witted C. So knowing that we know about RFT, we know that A will be associated with C, or the Irish being dim-witted will be associated via a transformation of functions. But now, let's say that you already have feelings of hatred and display aggressive behaviors towards those who are dim-witted. This might then be displayed towards the Irish via that transformation of functions. So we have stimulus B, the heavy drinkers, related to stimulus A, that are the Irish, and then we have stimulus B, the heavy drinkers again, related to stimulus C, that are the dim-witted, and then we've got the feelings of hatred over here. So this will then transfer across, and then over to the Irish. And conceptually, this makes sense. But let's take a little bit of a closer look at the empirical evidence behind RFT and prejudice. So in terms of basic research, there are a handful of studies that are regarding RFT and prejudice. Dixon, Rafelt, Zlomke, and Robinson in 2006, they investigated frames of terrorist images and American images. They used rigorous match-to-sample procedures to determine if a frame of coordination could be created between terrorists and these American images. And not surprisingly, participants had a difficult time creating these frames, suggesting that pre-existing verbal functions of images interfered with the ability to create new or contradictory frames. And in a follow-up study, Dixon's, Lomke, and Refelt in 2006 replicated these results while attempting a transformation of functions using word pairings again, such as peace, unity, and resolve. And though these frames were not reliably formed, higher levels of accurate responding were noted, suggesting that though pre-existing biases may exist that prevent frames of prejudice from being changed, via transformation, this may ease the process. But this restructuring of frames may require direct training because, again, they use rigorous match to sample, sitting down at a table with pictures. Focusing more on frame reconstruction, Dixon, Brannon, Nastali, and Mui in 2009 conducted a series of experiments. First, a Likert-style survey asked participants to rank images on a scale of 1 to 10 being 1 terrorist to 1 being not terrorist and 10 being terrorist, both before and after match to sample training had occurred for arbitrary line stimuli, so just little squiggles all around the page that meant nothing, random consonant, vowel, consonant words, pictures of Middle Eastern males and pictures of American males, and pictures of traditional American and traditional terrorist images. So there's a lot they were working with here. And they found that arbitrary lines and consonant, vowel, consonant words could acquire terrorist or not terrorist labels after match to sample training via a transformation of functions when being paired with the Middle Eastern and American images and males, depending on which one they were paired with. I hope we're still on the same page here. This can get kind of confusing. Next, these results were replicated despite changing the pictures in the Middle Eastern group from more terrorist-looking pictures to Muslims wearing more traditional garb. And then in the third experiment, the procedures remained the same, but the Middle Eastern and American images were subbed for squares of different colors. So the Middle Eastern images were subbed for squares in the shades of blue, and the American images were replaced by squares in different shades of red. You're probably asking, where are we going with this? But the results here showed that the red, or the American images, were rated as more close towards terrorist than the blue or Middle Eastern images, as they were rated more closely towards not terrorist. This confirms that the pre-existing frames hindered the development of the new frames and the reconstruction of the old frames, right? Because the procedures were the same, they just merely changed the squares, so this transformation of functions was not able to occur. So in summary of the basic research, it suggests that frames of prejudice exist between American images and Middle Eastern or terrorist images. Attempting to restructure these frames is difficult and may require direct training, or it may require something outside of RFT. And pointing to the idea that we intervene before frame development, this may be the most beneficial route in reducing prejudice according to an RFT account because it is so difficult to restructure already existing frames. So now let's look at the applied research. The difficulty in supporting an RFT account for prejudice is the lack of research that extends beyond the laboratory or basic setting. Research surrounding RFT and its application to the real world have centered around conceptual rather than experimental applications. Analysis often dictates a historical or fictional event, and then RFT is laid over the top of this event to give a possible explanation for how prejudice behavior may occur as a result. See Roche and colleagues in 2001, and also see Dixon and colleagues in 2003. For RFT to progress as an efficacious theory of prejudice formation, it is imperative for future studies to investigate RFT and prejudice in an applied or real-world setting. For example, hearing reports, reading magazine or newspaper articles, witnessing an event firsthand, these could potentially offer more socially acceptable or generalizable methods to investigating RFT's account for prejudice rather than rigorous match-to-sample procedures from basic research, because we know that's not how people learn every day. You don't sit at tables matching pictures over and over again and being reinforced to do so. So translational research. This is research that bridges the gap between applied and basic research. And according to Critchfield in 2011, in the field of applied behavior analysis, there is a need for translational research between basic and applied fields. In RFT's account for prejudice, this is no exception. Research focuses almost exclusively in basic settings, with those studies calling for a replication or a slight variation of those procedures used. And there is no extension beyond the area of terrorism. A call for translational research is needed to provide more groundwork to move the analysis of RFT and prejudice into the applied setting. So now let's look at a possible research extension here. As previously expressed, future studies should focus on applied or translational research, or at least push the basic research past the rigorous match-to-sample procedures. There's a heavy focus on these match-to-sample procedures in the laboratory that limits the true consideration for this RFT account of prejudice. The challenge, however, comes with finding a fruitful applied study. So ethically, it may not be in the best interest to study frames revolving around negative prejudices, as prejudice frames may be strengthened through some of the procedures from confirmation bias. But looking into the creation of an innocent or positive frame via transformation of functions may be worth consideration. So let's look at some of the pieces we've already talked about here. So Roche and colleagues in 2001 have already conceptually shown that frame formation can occur through just information being delivered in one context and then in another context. Dixon and colleagues in 2006 and 2009, as well as Starts in 1958, have shown that word association can serve to change reported perceptions of nationalities via a transformation of functions. And Hayes, Cohenberg, and Hayes in 1991 demonstrated that it is possible to create a frame of reinforcement via transformation of function. So if we take all these into combination, it would appear that we have the tools needed to investigate RFT and prejudice in an applied setting using more of a positive prejudice or an innocent form. So consider participants receiving information on certain nationalities while watching a news program or reading a newspaper or something to that effect. One piece of this information could include some level of positive emotion. So we'll have the 2 bits of information that have the little links here, and then have one of those links be to some kind of positive emotion. And then before and after this, participants could rate their feelings towards certain nationalities or be put into a situation where they directly interact with this nationality and then measure the behavior that occurs afterwards. Consideration into procedures such as this could promote an RFT account for prejudice through this applied research, or at least more generalizable basic research, while also maintaining clear ethical boundaries, because we can't go around just creating frames of degradation towards certain nationalities. But in conclusion, RFT may provide a potential explanation behind prejudice through arbitrary relational responding via a transformation of functions. There is already support of this notion through conceptual and basic research. The need for applied and translational research is there, and this gap needs to be filled in order to put more weight on this RFT account for prejudice. Once this has been established, pending the results, strategies to reduce or restructure negative prejudices and prevent the formation of these prejudice frames may be examined in an effort to reduce the unwarranted distress from those affected by these prejudices every single day. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Again, if you would like more information on this, I absolutely recommend consulting the literature. Go Falcons.